Hello and welcome to this Introduction to Cultural Studies lecture on NPTEL, and we're just about to begin a new text today in this particular lecture, and the text which we'll start with today is on your screen. It's called Gender Trouble, Feminism and a Subversion of Identity by Judith Butler. So we just finished a series of texts looking at the different configurations of culture and cultural identities in postmodern conditions, in colonial conditions, etc. So this particular lecture is going to be really interesting because it's going to take off a new direction in terms of cultural studies and the way in which cultural identities are produced and reproduced and generated and manufactured through gendered identities. So this collusion between culture and gender is something that this particular book does very well, examines very well, I think, and we're going to look at it quite closely in great details in terms of understanding how gender becomes a very key concern, a very key issue in cultural studies. So Butler, before we begin with this particular text, a few sentences, a few lines in Butler. I mean, Judith Butler is one of those figures, one of the seminal figures actually, who straddled postmodernism, post-structuralism, as well as gender studies and gender identities. And she's someone who people heavily draw on in terms of looking at masculinity, femininity, masculine identities, feminine identities, and the production of identities through gendered medium, in popular culture, in discursive situations, etc. So she is famous for many terms that she has sort of pioneered and revolutionized. Performativity is one of the key terms that she keeps going back to. Performativity is obviously one of those terms again which connect postmodernism with post-structuralism and then of course with gender studies as well. So this particular book will be a really key text for us in terms of looking at how gender is a cultural construct, in terms of how gender is a cultural reproduction, a cultural process of production and reproduction. And what this book highlights, among many things, is the artificiality of the entire idea of gender. So how gender is basically a process, a performance, which attempts to conform to certain codes which are topical to the particular culture, particular space-time. So this particular book, Gender Trouble, and of course the very title is quite provocative. Trouble is a very provocative term, and Butler deliberately uses it, and at some point in the book, and we will look at the particular section, she explains her choice of the word trouble and why does she choose the word trouble. To what extent is gender trouble? To what extent can we trouble the idea of gender, the accepted idea of gender, which is obviously what Butler sets out to do in this particular text. So this particular book could be seen, could be read as a very delicious deconstruction of the idea of gender, the normative idea of gender, and an examination, a very urgent examination of how gender is constructed and produced and manipulated through certain kind of cultural codes. And of course the cultural codes depend on a series of factors, including but not limited to race, economy, language, religion, etc. And again we're back to this sort of one of the key things that we've been running through in this particular course, and that is looking at culture as an entanglement, an asymmetric entanglement between abstraction and materiality. So gender too fits bill in terms of it being an entanglement between abstraction and materiality. It's a very material sort of determinant, a very material component of gender, which includes a series of factors such as the body, language, etc. And there's also a sort of abstract component of gender, which is part of the discursive design and which gender sort of operates. So this book is really interesting and very, very crucial for any serious study of culture, and we'll look at it in close details in this particular lecture and a series of lectures coming up. So let's begin at the very beginning of this particular book, Gender Trouble by Judith Butler. So at the very outset, Butler talks about how, to what extent is gender a category, so what is the sort of the ontology of the category of gender? And there's a series of quotations that she offers at the very beginning, and it should be on the screen at the moment. So the Simone de Beauvoir, Euler Kristeva, Louis Irigaray, Michel Foucault. So these are the thinkers, these are the intellectuals that she draws on and also critiques at various points in this particular book. And one of the really key things in this particular book is a very thorough examination of the different different definitions of gender at different points of time by different philosophers, including before Kristeva, Irigaray, and Foucault. And she looks at the differences in terms of the idea of gender as defined by these thinkers. And she draws on and critiques as well as deconstructs the different definitions of gender across different points of time by various thinkers. And of course Monique Wittig also features quite heavily in this particular text. Now, at the very beginning, she talks about two very key terms which are sort of germane to the entire umbrella term of culture studies, and the two terms are politics and representation, right? And then she goes on to sort of define the difference between the two terms. So, what is politics and what is representation? And of course, representation, as you know, is a really crucial category. I mean, we've read Pava, we have read a series of other sort of thinkers and writers where representation becomes a very key thing. I mean, Lyotard too talks about representation in a very postmodern kind of a way. But O.E. Butler sort of sets out to define the very sort of difference between, ontological difference between politics and representation in terms of their location in gender studies. So she goes on to say, on one hand, representation serves as the operative term within a political process that seeks to extend visibility and legitimacy to women as political subjects. On the other, representation is a normative function of a language which is said either to reveal or to distort what is assumed to be true about the category of woman. So we have this apparent dichotomy in the description of definitions. On the one hand, representation is the legitimizing process. Is a process through which a particular subject is legitimized, is made visible. And the representation of woman can be seen as a process through which woman emerges political subjects. So that's the positive definition of representation, something which invests legitimacy to woman, something which gives visibility, invests visibility to women, and something which invests this entire subjectivity of women as political subjects. But on the other hand, representation is also a normative function, which is said to reveal or distort what is assumed to be true about the category of women. So representation is really a very complex process, because in one hand it can be an emancipatory factor, it can be an emancipatory process which offers agency to the subject. It has an agentic function, it offers voice, agency, legitimacy, etc. But on the other hand, representation can also be constricting, in the sense that it can restrict the subject to the normative function that is defined by the dominant categories of knowledge. And it is also used sometimes selectively to reveal or distort what is assumed to be true about the category of women. So the word assumed over here is very, very interesting and very important. So there's a set of assumptions, an economy of assumptions, an economy of expectations, which sort of are invested into this normative definition of woman. And representation can sometimes consolidate that economy. It can reveal that economy, it can distort that economy, it can also consolidate that economy. So representation becomes a very crucial term for Butler at the very beginning of this particular book. So it is a two-way process. It can be emancipatory, it can be legitimizing, it can also be restrictive, it can also sort of conform to the codes, the dominant codes of conduct, the dominant codes of sort of ontological codes which define the woman. So representation can be liberating as well as constricting. Representation can be a positive term, it can be revolutionary, it can offer agency, it can offer legitimacy, but at the same time it can also be restrictive. So it's a very interesting term that Butler sort of offers, throws at us at the very beginning of this particular book. And one of the things which we'll notice about this book is that it's very provocative. It's almost designed to be provocative. Therein lies the radical nature of this particular book. The radical quality of the book lies precisely in its provocative quality. And Butler makes it very, very clear. And we just read, if you remember, we just read Franz Fanon, where also provocation, the idea of being provocative becomes a discursive, strategy in that particular book. So, Fanon is very, very provocative. I mean, he makes his dissent very clear. He makes his sort of resentment very, very clear, and he makes his subjective position, the subjectivity very, very clear throughout the particular book. And therein lies the radical nature of Black Skin, White Marks, which we just finished. Now, if we look at Butler, she considers language, she takes language very, very seriously in terms of a component of gender. So language becomes a very crucial component of gender. And again, we're looking at an entanglement between abstract apparatus and material processes. So how you use language, how do you sort of conform to language, and how is language itself a gendered quality, a gendered process, a gendered category. So these are things which are examined in great details in very radical ways in this particular book. Now, if you look at this highlighted section in the screen, which should be in the screen at the moment, where she says, the domains of political and linguistic representation set out in advance the criterion by which subjects themselves are formed, which with the result that representation is extended only to what can be acknowledged as a subject. In other words, the qualifications of being a subject must first be met before representation can be extended. So we are immediately into a very controversial zones, and she says representation can only come after legitimacy. So a subject must conform, must meet the standards, must meet the expectations of a particular category before representation can be extended. So representation becomes part of the legitimizing process. However, representation is oftentimes, more often than not, part of the dominant discursive strategy. And when I say dominant discursive strategy, I mean that a human subject must conform to the dominant discourse before it can be represented, before it can receive representation. So representation becomes sometimes quite collusive with the dominant discourses of knowledge, dominant discourses of gender, dominant discourses of politics, etc. So representation can become, more often than not, a part of status quo, a part of the dominant codes. So the first expectation of the subject, the first sort of aspiration of the subject in a very normative sense would be to satisfy or meet the expectations, after which only after the subject is acknowledged as a subject can representation come into being. So representation is a post-acknowledgement process. So the subject needs to be acknowledged first as a subject. The subject must conform first as a subject. Only then can representation come into being as a process. So Butler is very cautious and very guarded in terms of looking at representation as a purely liberational kind of a process. So she says more often than not, representation is an extended process of legitimization. Representation is an extension of status quo, an extension of dominant discourse, etc., because the subject must first conform before it can get represented. So representation more often than not is part of the dominant strategy. And then she talks about regulation and how regulation becomes a very key term, a very key category in terms of gender, in terms of gendered identity, in terms of gendered representation. And she goes on to say that the subject is subjected to these ideas of regulation of structures. They're subjected to them, form, define, and reproduce in accordance with the requirements of those structures. If this analysis is right, then a juridical formation, the judicial formation of language and politics that represent women as a subject of feminism is itself a discursive formation, an effect of a given version of representation in politics. And a feminist subject turns out to be discursively constituted by the very political system that is supposed to facilitate its emancipation. So at the very beginning of Gender Trouble, she's looking at how the idea of liberation, the idea of emancipation can sometimes be consumed within the codes which inform the dominant discursive strategies. So she goes on to say that the very act of subjectification is actually part of the discursive system. So the feminist subject turns out to be discursively constituted at the very political system that is supposed to facilitate its emancipation. So the very political system which is supposed to emancipate or facilitate the emancipation of women is actually, part of the discursive strategy. So, you can't really escape discursivity. That's the key message in this particular highlighted section. So discursivity becomes the hegemony condition. And so the entire idea of feminism, the entire idea of feminine subjectivity can actually sometimes, more often than not, be consumed by the discursivity which informs that particular process. So true liberation can actually come with the questioning of the discursivity, and more often than not, the feminist subjectivity is actually part of the dominant discursive strategy, and it can't escape it. It can't escape the discursivity which overdetermines its subjectivity. So discursivity becomes a very important qualification, a very important category in Butler, and she looks at the ways in which discursivity should be questioned and how discursivity oftentimes consumes any effort to emancipate, any effort to sort of liberate, and how all these liberational strategies, emancipatory strategies are actually embedded by discursivity, by dominant discursivity. So it becomes part of the status quo rather than being truly radical. Radicalism can actually sometimes become reified and become extensions of status quo, become extensions of dominant strategies. Okay. And then, of course, she moves on to the question of the subject. So the question of subject is obviously crucial in terms of looking at feminism, in terms of looking at masculinity, in terms of looking at patriarchy, etc. And subject is a very key term in cultural studies in general. So we are very interested in subject or subjectivity or subject position or subjecthood or the formation of subjects in cultural studies, because that's what, related to subject, we have this entire area of other components such as agency, liberation, hegemony, power, knowledge, etc. And then she goes on to say, the question of the subject is crucial for politics and for feminist politics in particular, because juridical subjects are invariably produced through certain exclusionary practices that do not show once the juridical structure of politics has been established. In other words, the political construction of the subject proceeds with certain legitimating and exclusionary aims, and these political operations are effectively concealed and naturalized by a political analysis that takes juridical structures as a foundation. So the key words over here, one of the things which we should be really interested in looking at gender trouble is that Butler's use of verbs are very, very important, and then she places the greatest emphasis on verbs, that part of speech that she's most interested in, because for her the entirety of gender is a process of becoming, unbecoming, rebecoming. So verbs become very important in Butler's discourse. So we need to examine the verbs very carefully in any description that Butler offers us. So if you look at this particular section and highlighted in yellow, where she talks about the idea of naturalization, construction, and then concealment, etc. So all these are verbs, and this is exactly the way in which she argues real legitimizing function, real emancipatory function are actually effaced away. And she goes on to say that every subject or every subject formation proceeds or operates to certain codes, and those codes are concealed, those codes are exclusive, those codes are not part of the not foregrounded actually, because then obviously the whole point of being a dominant discourse is to conceal the codes. So every subject formation, every act of subject formation is basically a sort of confirmation to certain codes, but those codes itself are concealed, those codes themselves are concealed, those codes are naturalized. And the process of naturalization is very important in Butler's analysis, because if you can't naturalize the codes, then obviously it's very difficult to be hegemonic. So the whole idea of something becoming hegemonic is by process of naturalization. So naturalization entails acceptance, naturalization entails acknowledgement, naturalization entails legitimacy. So naturalization is something which cannot be questioned, right? So if you naturalize something, you take it for granted, you assume it without questioning it. So that conceals its constructed quality. So that's the whole idea that Butler is trying to foreground and highlight over here. So she argues how the whole idea of creating a code which becomes hegemonic operates through concealment and naturalization. So concealment and naturalization become really crucial categories in Butler in terms of looking at how gender identities are produced, reproduced, and consolidated, right? So we have this idea of hegemonic gender, which is oftentimes, more often than not, heterosexual in quality. So this entire heterosexual, dominant, hegemonic gender operates through acts of concealment and through acts of naturalization, which make other kinds of gender identities marginalized, right? So the whole idea of something becoming hegemonic is through a process of naturalization and concealment, and these are very crucial categories in Butler's analysis. And then she goes on to say, juridical power inevitably produces what it claims merely to represent. Hence, politics must be concerned with the dual function of power, the juridical and the productive. So when you're questioning the entire discourse of power, we need to examine the juridical quality of power as well as the productive quality of power. Because what she says over here, that juridical power inevitably produces what it claims merely to represent. So production and representation are often merged in dominant discourses. So you produce certain rules, you produce certain laws, you produce certain codes, and then those codes are used to represent human subjects. So again, we're back where we began the very sort of outset in this particular book, how representation actually becomes extensions of power, extensions of productive power, etc. So representation and production often merge together in dominant discourses. So the rules which are produced, the codes which are produced are then used for representation. So those codes themselves become the codes of representation. So the codes of production, the codes of representation often merge in hegemony discourses, and that's something Butler goes on to define at the very beginning of this particular book. So representation, production, concealment, naturalization, these become very crucial categories for Butler. And she looks at these categories over and over again in terms of how these are used very effectively in terms of defining hegemonic gendered identities. So gendered identities obviously produce, so production becomes a very important category in gendered identities. Gender identities are represented, so representation becomes a very important category in gender studies. Now the point is, Butler would argue very effectively, and this is part of the radical thing that she does in this particular book, and that is the codes of production, the way in which you produce certain codes, hegemonic codes, and a codes of representation, they often merge in terms of looking at gendered identities. So gendered identities are often produced and represented simultaneously through certain hegemonic and dominant codes. And therein lies the process of construction of hegemonic gendered identities, which is obviously naturalized, right? So if we can naturalize the process, if we can conceal the constructed quality of the process, then obviously you won't notice the difference between production and representation. You look at it in the same thing. You look at it as one part, one given, one dominant given which happens, which operates without any act of construction, right? And this is exactly the triumph of any dominant discourse, that it manages to conceal its constructed quality, right, by merging its act of production and its act of representation, right? So this merge is very, very important, and Butler spends a lot of time on this, sort of examining this particular merge. Now, obviously, as I mentioned, verbs become very important in Butler's analysis, and then she's very, very interested in looking at how certain codes are concealed, certain codes are smuggled into what become hegemonic and dominant in due course of time through acts of repetition, through acts of representation, through acts of concealment. So concealment, representation, repetition, naturalizations, all these become very important processes in Butler's analysis of gender and gendered identities, because we are back again. So when we mentioned at the very beginning of this particular course, that production is a very crucial term in culture and culture studies, because culture identities, or culture itself, is an act of production, right, and also an act of representation. So and obviously this process of production happens through very materialistic ways. It incorporates a lot of material apparatus, it incorporates a lot of abstract apparatus, and it's a process of entanglement of materiality and abstraction. However, for a culture to become consolidated, to become hegemonic, it must naturalize its process. It must naturalize its constructed quality. Its constructed quality must be concealed in front of the subject. So the subject just consumes the hegemonic structure without realizing it's a construct. And it can only happen if the process of production and the process of representation merge together into becoming one given, one automatic assumption, one automatic given which is consumed and received without questioning. Okay? Now, and Butler says part of the process, part of the success of dominant gendered identities happens takes place because it becomes impossible to separate out gender from the political and cultural intersections in which it is invariably produced and maintained. So this is on your screen, highlighted in yellow, where she says that, part of the process in which this entire idea of dominant gendered identities become possible or become successful is by making it impossible to separate out gender from the politics of representation and the politics of production, right? So gender is obviously produced, gender identity is obviously produced through certain very, very coded acts, very coded configurations. However, this act of production merges seamlessly into an act of representation, and this seamlessness is a very crucial thing in dominant gendered identities. So the seams must never be exposed, right? So it is impossible to separate gender from the political and cultural intersections in which it is inevitably produced and maintained, right? And Butler says it is part of post-structuralist discourse, is part of the deconstructionist discourse of looking at gender. We should examine precisely these cultural configurations, these cultural productions, this cultural constructedness, which inform the process of gender identities. So unless we can do that, no serious study of gender is possible. And then she goes on to say the political assumption that there must be a universal basis for feminism, one which must be found in an identity assumed to exist cross-culturally, often accompanies the notion that the oppression of woman has some singular form discernible in a universal or hegemonic structure of patriarchy or masculine domination. The notion of a universal patriarchy has been widely criticized in recent years for its failure to account for the workings of gender oppression in concrete cultural context in which it exists. So Butler over here reminds us of the risk of universalization. One of the dangers, one of the pitfalls of universalization lies precisely in doing away with the topicality of discourses, the spatio-temporal, the contextual quality of discourses. So she warns us against looking at patriarchy as a meta-phenomenon, or femininity as a meta-phenomenon, or masculinity as a meta-phenomenon. And she reminds us that we must be critical of the tendency to totalize, of the tendency to universalize these discourses, right? So the entire idea of having a universal idea of feminism, a universal idea of masculine identity, patriarchal identity, etc., or even the narratives of oppression, so these actually to Butler are very, very risky categories, because that what it does is it does away with the topicality of the evil, the topicality of the subject position, or the subjectivity of subject position, which then becomes a reified category and a universalizing discourse. So universalizing is a tendency that Butler warns us against in this particular book, very, very crucially. And then, of course, the whole idea is to look at gender as a process which is tied to a particular, cultural condition, which is tied to a particular spatio-temporal condition. Unless you can do that, we run the risk of reification. We run the risk of totalization, which obviously will be consumed very, very quickly by the dominant discourses, which operate on totalizing tendencies as well. Okay, so totalization or universalization are tendencies that Butler warns us against, right? So. And then again, she goes on to say, and this is on the screen at the moment, highlighted in yellow, the presumption of a binary gender system implicitly retains belief in a mimetic relation of gender to sex, whereby gender mirrors sex or is otherwise restricted by it. So again, now she's talking about the biological idea of gender and the cultural idea of gender. And then she talks about how the presumption of a binary gender system, male, female, heterosexual, homosexual, implicitly retains a belief in a mimetic relation of gender to sex. So gender and biology, they are sort of mimetically related in dominant discourses, according to Butler, and that is something that she questions. When the constructed status of gender is theorized as radically independent of sex, gender itself becomes a free-floating artifice, with the consequence that a man and masculine might just as easily signify a female body as a male one, and woman and feminine a male body as easily as a female one. So this is a very interesting use of post-structuralism that Butler uses over here in terms of looking at gender studies. And she says over here that we must be very, very interested, we must be examining the idea of biological sex and gender, which is more of a cultural category. And we must see to the fact that man and masculine might be easily applicable to female body, or as much applicable to female body as a male one, and woman and feminine can be applicable to a male body as easily as a female one. And this can only happen if you look at a non-binary, a non-mimetic way of looking at gender. So if you take gender as a non-mimetic, a non-binary term, only then can we look at masculine or feminine as not overdetermined by biology. So therein lies a difference between gender and biological sex to Butler, because being a man or a woman has nothing to do with being masculine or feminine, because masculinity and femininity, these are constructions, these are cultural constructions, these are behavioral constructions which pertain to certain codes of conduct. And according to Butler, the codes are very, very important, and the codes actually sometimes don't rely on biological gender, on biological sex, whether you're male or female doesn't matter in terms of looking at masculinity or femininity. So the terms masculinity or femininity can be applied to anyone irrespective of the biological sex. And this is a very crucial category, a very crucial examination that Butler offers in Gender Trouble, and she sort of develops this idea, she develops this argument throughout this particular book as we move on. So already we are in the domain of construction, we're in the domain of performativity, we're in the domain of mimesis. And performativity becomes a very important category in Butler. She goes on to say very, very crucially that biological sex and gender have oftentimes no relation at all to each other, and we must look beyond a very binaristic understanding of gender and look at gender as a more pluralistic, plastic, performative idea, whereby maleness or femaleness or femininity or masculinity, these can operate independently of biological sex. And this is a very, very radical thing that Butler sets out to state in this particular book. So, and then she goes on to say, highlighted in yellow on her screen, that the body is itself a construction, as in a myriad bodies that constitute the domain of gendered subjects. Bodies cannot be said to have a signifiable existence prior to the mark of the gender. The question then emerges, to what extent does a body come into being and through the marks of gender? How do we conceive, how do you reconceive the body no longer as a passive medium or instrument awaiting the enlivening capacity of a distinctly immaterial will? So body becomes a very crucial site for Butler, a very crucial space for Butler. It can be potentially a subversive side, it can be a conforming side, it can be a side which conforms certain codes, it can be a side which questions the codes, etc. So the body becomes a verb to Butler. So the body is being, the body is a process in Butler's discourse. So this is, again, part of what I just said, that we need to be aware, we need to pay very careful attention to the way verbs flow in Butler's works, and especially in Gender Trouble. So the body becomes the verb, the body becomes a process of being and so becoming, rebecoming, unbecoming through different discursive formations. So it's a construction. Butler goes on to say the body is a self-construction, as in a myriad bodies that constitute the domain of gendered subjects. So gendered subjects are constructions, constructions to certain bodies, apparatus. So discourses too are bodies and qualities. So bodies cannot be said to have a signifiable existence prior to the mark of the gender, right? So it's erroneous, Butler would argue, the bodies are pre-discursive, right? So bodies are discursive in quality. So the discursivity of body is something that Butler highlights over here. So the question then emerges, to what extent does the body come into being and through the marks of gender? So the bodies come into being through certain markers of gender, and those markers of gender are obviously culturally constructed, discursively constructed. So the body becomes feminine and masculine, sometimes irrespective of biological sex. And this is again a very post-structuralist way of looking at gender. So bodies come into being through certain markers, mediated by those markers, which are obviously culturally constructed. And the second question which follows from this naturally is, how do we reconceive the body no longer as a passive medium or instrument awaiting the enlivening capacity of a distinctly immaterial will? So how can we look at body as not a passive side, but an active side of interrogation, an active side of contestation? And this is, according to Butler, the very radical way in which we can question the codes of conduct which pertain to dominant discourses of gender, by making the body an active side of contestation, an active side of questioning, rather than a passive medium of receiving discourses, receiving the codes of conduct, receiving the dominant codes which are constructed culturally. So rather than being a passive receptacle to the codes, the body can potentially become, according to Butler, a site of questioning, a site of contestation. And therein lies a subversive potential of gender, subversive potential of performativity. So performativity is a very embodied phenomenon which questions the very constructed quality of gendered codes, gendered identities, and the very codes of conduct which are culturally constituted and constructed. So this concludes the first lecture on Butler's Gender Trouble, and we begin to look at the way in which gender becomes a construct which can be deconstructed through play, through trouble, through problematizing the entire idea of binaristic way of looking at gender, and to make gender less and less seamless and more constructed in quality. You can do that, according to Butler, then we can look at gender as what it really is, a set of codes which the body performs and conforms to at different points in time. So I conclude the first lecture on Butler's Gender Trouble with this, and we'll continue with this in the next lectures to come. Thank you for your attention.